Okay, it is 4 o'clock. People might start trickling in, but welcome to this webinar. Jay Cumberland is our Equal Justice Works Fellow. He is sponsored by the eBay Foundation, and he's a lawyer with our worker cooperatives and housing circle. A lot of businesses have been closing because of the coronavirus, and so Jay quickly put together this presentation, hopefully to help save a lot of our favorite small businesses from closing. If you have any questions, please save them until the end, or feel free to type them in the chat box. We are recording this presentation, so please turn off your video and I'll put you on mute. I think that's it. Take it away, Jay.
Yeah, thanks, Tia. Yeah, as Tia said, my name is Jay Cumberland. I'm an attorney at the Law Center, and the work that I do right now is a 2-year project to create new legal strategies to help workers and small business owners find a way to convert the businesses into worker cooperatives. And I also help tenants find a way to buy buildings from their landlords and convert those into housing cooperatives. So I also work at the Sustainable Economies Law Center. If you aren't that familiar with the Sustainable Economies Law Center, we exist to provide legal research, advocacy, advice to create more just and resilient economies. So in a way, we're set up to build a world where the economy doesn't have these boom and bust cycles that we keep seeing. We want one that's more sustainable and that works for more people. Today, before I start, I want to give 2 brief disclaimers. The first is that while I am an attorney, I'm not your attorney, and any information that you learn about today in this webinar, you should consult with a different attorney before you act upon that information. And second, while Tia did say that hopefully this advice will be useful to some people and can help some small businesses during this crisis, there are definitely no silver bullets. There's no magical solution that will make this work for everyone. So I don't want to exaggerate the claims for what this information will lead to, but I hope that it's helpful to some of you in this presentation. For those of you that just joined, we'll save room for questions at the end, probably 10 or so minutes. So feel free to type them in as we go along, but otherwise you can ask them once we get to the end of the presentation. So 2 questions that are brought up by the topic of this presentation. The first is, what is worker ownership? And the second is, what is it a solution to? When you combine those together, you sort of get a third question, which is, how can worker ownership be a solution to this crisis that we're in? So I'm going to walk through those 3 different layers of this presentation as we go through. And I'll start with, what is worker ownership? That's sort of a basic premise of this whole webinar. And unfortunately, I don't have a lot of time to go into the basics of worker ownership or cooperatives, but I'm not even as good at it as my coworker Ricardo is, and luckily he did a webinar last week on the basics of cooperatives. So if during this presentation you can't quite figure out what co-ops are, you can go back and watch that webinar and get some basic information that'll help you understand what you learned today better. So I would encourage you to go ahead and do that once you get a chance. I will give a basic overview, though, of what worker ownership is. Worker ownership can really mean a broad range of things, although it's often used to mean one particular thing. At the very basic level, worker ownership just means that you work in a business and you own the business. So that applies to small business owners. They work in businesses and they own businesses. It applies to anybody that isn't basically like an absentee business owner, like the monopoly man that just makes money from investments and doesn't actually do any work. It applies to everyone in those particular categories. There's this old term called petit bourgeois that I learned as a philosophy major and need to say to justify having a philosophy degree. That applies to this kind of a scenario. But more broadly, and as sort of a term of art used in the field that I work in as an attorney, worker ownership often applies to businesses where everybody that works in those businesses also has an ownership stake in those businesses. This is basically a cooperative, although there are other forms like employee stock ownership plans. These are businesses that are operated based on democratic principles, so that instead of money guiding the control of the business. It's really a democratic principle of one person and one vote determining how the business operates, and everybody has a share of the profits. I'm going to walk through the solutions that I'll walk through later, sort of go through these different layers of worker ownership. So that's why I think it's important to say the different ways that worker ownership can show up. Now I'm going to pivot a little bit to talk about the crisis that we're in so that we all have a shared understanding of where I'm coming from in talking about worker ownership as a solution. It's a solution to primarily, for small businesses, a cash flow problem. Small businesses don't have enough money to weather this storm without getting money from somewhere. The median small business in America has what's called 27 cash buffer days. This means that if that business completely stops making money, it can survive, it can pay all of its expenses for 27 days, and then it's out of money. If you look at the bottom of the screen, you can see that businesses like restaurants and retail businesses have even shorter average cash buffer days. So they're not even able to last as long as the average small business. In the Bay Area, this is particularly acute because I think we're in around the 30th day of this shelter in place where businesses aren't having a lot of money come in. So some businesses that are not essential businesses and have not been able to continue operating are just almost completely out of cash at this point. So those businesses are turning and looking for places to find money and looking for ways to cut costs too, which I'll talk about in a minute. But they're not able to find money from traditional lenders. As soon as this crisis began, which was right at the beginning of March, lending from big banks and credit unions to small businesses decreased substantially. At big banks and at credit unions, lending decreased by over half. They started approving only half as much small business loans as they did previously. And at small banks, which are more favorable to small businesses, the lending also decreased by around 10%. Even if you could get loans, even if small businesses could get loans from these providers, they're typically loans that come with hard debt, which in a time like this, when the future is really uncertain, it's not necessarily even an option that small business owners are considering or should consider, because you don't know if when you're going to be able to get money to pay off those loans. So even if you could turn to this source of capital, many small businesses are not, which leaves a lot to depend on the federal response and other sources of funding. This is where many are applying for loans, soft loans with forgivable terms like the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program and the Paycheck Protection Program. For many, as many know, these loans are not coming in as quickly as they need to be. Some businesses still have not got these loans. And as I said, we're 30 days into this crisis when many businesses don't have any money at this point. So it's a pretty dire scenario. And while these programs seem to have massive amounts of money attached to them, $300 billion for small businesses in the first round of stimulus funding, sources show that we would have needed $1 trillion to allow all of the small businesses to last for 30 days. So we didn't have enough money from the beginning for this source of capital to allow small businesses to weather this storm. And even if it was enough, businesses that really aren't small businesses have been written into this program and are able to access these loans. You have any business with under 500 employees in an individual location that are able to apply for these loans. That's things like big chain hotels, big chain restaurants, and other things like that, taking this money first and getting a large percentage of it. And big banks, which, as the previous slide showed, don't lend to small businesses much anyway, are administering a lot of this financing and are not lending to small businesses that don't have existing debt with them. So it's somewhat of a dire situation where businesses are running out of money. They're trying to find money and there just isn't enough money to go around. So they're doing what they can on their own without having to depend on other people. They're reducing expenses. So they're laying off employees. They are furloughing employees. They're reducing the wages and the hours that employees are working as a way to reduce expenses and expand the amount of cash buffer that they have. Where possible, essential businesses are trying to preserve as much income as they can, non-essential businesses are trying to switch to selling online or something like that in order to preserve the amount of income coming in as well. And many small businesses have been doing great work in order to support their workers through this time. Not every business has, obviously, but many businesses are, even if they're laying off employees. They're doing things like extending benefits for a few months so that people maintain their health insurance during this crisis, even if they are laid off. They're affording workers the opportunities to access at least some money when they reduce their hours or they lay them off so that they can access the state's unemployment insurance fund. And the last thing that I'll bring up is about the California's unemployment insurance fund, which frankly, I don't think has been mentioned enough in terms of the consequences, just the state of California's unemployment insurance fund. This will be relevant in a part of the presentation coming up. Essentially, California's unemployment insurance fund is not built for recessions. In the Great Recession in 2008, it ran dry and became insolvent in less than a year into the crisis. And so California had to look to the federal government and borrow $10 billion to shore up the unemployment insurance fund and last through the length of the recession in 2008. And California still owes $8 billion of that. Every other state that borrowed money from the federal government has been able to pay back what they borrowed in 2008. But California still carries almost all of its debt. That's because the only way to pay back that loan is by reducing unemployment insurance benefits, which they're already too low in a state that is incredibly expensive, or by raising costs in the form of payroll taxes on employers. And there's just not been appetite to do that. In the crisis right now, it's estimated that California's unemployment insurance fund will run dry in less than 4 weeks, which is before the end of the shelter in place in the Bay Area right now, which is the beginning of May. So it's going to come time again for California to look to the federal government, borrow billions of dollars for its unemployment insurance fund, and then try to figure out a way to pay those loans. And most likely, I would guess that's going to come by costs being passed on to employers in the form of payroll taxes. So even though people can get unemployment, it's not a perfect scenario, obviously. I think everyone knows that. So let's take a collective breath after having me explain this crisis to you, which you're in and probably know a great deal about anyway. And I'll move towards talking about some ways that worker ownership can help small businesses weather this crisis and also help their workers weather this crisis. The first thing I'll talk about is a way to reduce expenses and preserve income for a business during this crisis by doing something a little bit differently than laying off or furloughing employees or reducing hours and wages. I want to preface this section by saying this section is absolutely not a silver bullet. Nothing in this is a solution for everyone. And I think particularly this solution will most likely only work for businesses that already pay a fairly high salary or a fairly high wage to workers, and where the workers have income still or savings that they have on hand that will allow them to weather this crisis without needing the income from unemployment insurance. So that's a caveat, and that's a fairly narrow category of people that this will apply to, but no one's talking about it, so I thought that I would at least bring it up and talk to you about it. So right now, as I said, many businesses are trying to handle this situation by furloughing workers, which means continuing to employ them while paying them no salary, or at least an extremely reduced salary, and continuing to pay them benefits. Or they're laying workers off, or they're reducing their hours and wages. All three of these options allow workers to continue to make some money through a combination of money coming from the business that they work for and money from the state's unemployment insurance fund. Most of these, you might be familiar with the just general unemployment insurance, but hour and wage reduction, if you reduce hours and wages by more than 10%, workers can file for a form of unemployment insurance, which is called work sharing. So that's another way that they're mixing benefits from the business and from the unemployment insurance fund. The cost of this to employers and small businesses is more payroll tax in the future. So while it allows them to cut costs right now, those costs will eventually come back and rebound to those small businesses that are laying people off in the form of more payroll taxes to pay off the federal loans that California is probably going to go and get to supplement its unemployment insurance fund, and to pay off the existing loans that California needs to find some way to pay off. And the way that small businesses pay into these funds is based on their history of laying people off. So the more people that you have made depend on the unemployment insurance system, the more that you will pay in payroll tax towards the unemployment insurance fund in the future. And therefore, the less profits you'll make, or businesses will reduce the amount that they pay employees to make up for that cost running forward. So that will cost you eventually. An alternative option that differs from the three that businesses are using is doing a technical wage and hour reduction, but then supplementing the pay that has been reduced with equity. This is where you get into a form of worker ownership, where you're giving the people that work in your business some amount of equity or ownership in your business. This is similar in terms of the cost to the business moving forward. Those workers that now have equity in your business will be entitled to profits moving forward. And depending on the rights that you attach to that equity, they may also get voting rights in your business, which would mean that a small business owner would have less control over the business moving forward. So it's not a perfect option, but it is an option that's not being mentioned. Is it legal? I wouldn't tell you it if it wasn't. So basically in California, you have to pay a certain amount of someone's wages or salary in a particular type of currency. You have to pay it in cash. You have to pay minimum wage and overtime wages for hourly employees in cash. And you have to pay the amount required to exempt a salaried employee from overtime laws and other laws in cash. So minimum wage is about $12 an hour, maybe more depending on where you live in California. And the salaried exemption amount is around $50,000 a year. Anything above that can be paid in anything that is worth money. You can pay someone in cows, you can pay somebody in chickens, you can pay somebody in Bitcoin, you can pay somebody in, I don't know, reduced room and board. If you're their landlord too, you can pay them in that. And you can pay them in equity. It's not clear. It's not like 100%. It's not as if this has happened before or someone has done this before. So I'll say from the get-go that it's not clear how the California unemployment insurance division would handle this type of situation. But generally, this would lead into the situation where the employer would be asked by the employee to file a work sharing claim so they can access some unemployment insurance benefits. And that's in any case where you reduce hours or wages by more than 10% for a number of your employees. However, what you're doing if a small business does this method is you're not reducing wages, you're changing the type of payment by which you're paying wages. Because in California, a wage can be anything. It's any money or other value received in exchange for labor. So you're just exchanging one method of payment for another. And while you can't, it's illegal to have your employees waive their right to file unemployment insurance claims or work sharing claims, you have a good faith basis for not triggering unemployment claims based on this information. But again, this is a case where you should consult with your attorneys or another attorney before engaging in this as a strategy for your small business right now, just because it hasn't been tested. This is where we get into talking about why your employees would even want to do this, because I get it. The employees are sacrificing pay right now. They're getting paid in equity. That's not liquid money. They can't use that money right now to buy food. They can't use that money right now to pay rent. And that's why this as an option will not work for many people right now. In April, a third of renters in America couldn't pay their rent. So if your business is employing people that are in that situation, this is not an option for you. This is most likely an option for people that have cash on hand or savings on hand in industries that pay fairly high wages. Workers are also having to overcome the fact that they're going to be paying taxes on money that they don't see because it's equity. And you're giving them something, the value of which depends on your business being able to continue into the future. And no one knows what's happening right now. We don't know how long this is going to last. You don't know when the reserves, when your business's revenue is going to increase back up to the level that it was before this all started, or if it will. There are various ways to talk to your employees about selling this option, though, beyond doing the formal things that I've mentioned in this deal sweetener category on the right. What your employees are gaining is equity equivalent to the amount of salary that they're sacrificing. And on top of that, they're gaining a right to profits of the business moving forward. So they're actually getting more, assuming that your business can continue into the future, than they would in terms of just pure monetary value by taking their normal salary for right now. They're also getting the ability to have a say in how your business operates, assuming you attach voting rights to their equity and things like that. So I'll move on to the deal sweeteners, which are formal things you can do to add on to selling this to your employees. One, as I've just mentioned, is attaching voting rights to the equity rights in your business that you're giving to these employees if you pursue this method. Most of the time, voting rights in a business are proportional to equity. So this, while it sweetens the deal a little bit, if your employees don't earn equity that gives them collectively some kind of majority stake in your business or close to it, they're still not going to have much say in the business. So you can do things beyond that to sell it. You can give them special voting rights, like the right to exclusively appoint a certain number of the directors in your business or something like that. You can also go further and give them a right of first refusal or a right of first offer, which means that if you ever decided to sell your business, assuming you're the one that remains the majority shareholder, then they have a right to buy that business, to make a first offer on your business, or to match an offer that's made by a third party. And that gives them assurance that this business will continue forward, that the equity stake that they have in this business will continue earning profits for them and will pay off down the road. So that's the first option. Definitely not perfect, definitely not widely applicable, but still it is an option that's not being talked about, and wanted to put it on the table. So with that, we'll move into what probably most of you came here to thinking that I would talk about, which is selling your business completely to your workers, creating a worker cooperative out of your business. I think that this is the ultimate deal sweetener. If you were gonna consider any of the things that I've just talked about, this is the way to actually sell it to your employees, and this actually brings in more benefits to you as a small business owner and to your small business than doing the sort of temporary gap filling method that I just discussed. In a co-op conversion, basically you transfer all of the ownership and all of the control in your business to the workers, although you can also remain a part of the business. And so you would also have equal ownership and equal control to your workers. You can do this immediately, just how a lot of cooperative conversions happen, or this can occur in a few stages. So you could sell 33% of your equity at one time and then sell the rest of it in subsequent years or something like that. Just commit yourself to the process of moving forward. So control transfers in the form of just voting rights, which, unlike in a traditional business, if you're forming a co-op, voting rights become detached from equity. The amount of say that you have in the business is no longer in proportion to the amount of equity that you hold in the business. One person has one vote for the board of directors, essentially, and on other important decisions about the business. This is how a business form that is traditionally controlled by money becomes controlled by sort of more democratic principles, although our political system is still very much controlled by money. So it's maybe better than our political system in terms of democracy. And then ownership also transfers. In equity transfers, that's part of it, but then rights to profits also transfer. And profits become distributed not based on the amount of equity that someone holds in the business, but rather based on the service or the hours that someone provides working for that business. That's a basic analysis of what a cooperative conversion is. There's much more to read out there online that you can find out about, and you can ask me about it more at the end of this presentation, because I'm just giving sort of a cursory overview of that. Now I want to talk about, why would you do this? Why does this sweeten the deal more than just adding on those things that I talked about at the end of the section about paying partially in equity? One, it sort of includes all of the deal sweeteners that you could include. It includes not only profit rights, it passes along voting rights too. This gives workers control over your board, over appointing management. It ensures them that the temporary income sacrifice that they're making right now will be outweighed by income benefit over time, because they have control of the business. They can keep it moving forward. They can keep it in business, assuming that's possible in this crisis. It also gives your business potentially access to working capital that you're unlikely to be able to find in another place. When you have outside financing that comes in and helps to finance a cooperative conversion, it typically brings a fairly decent percentage of working capital with it. And I know when I talked about big banks or just like traditional lenders, I said it's probably not a good idea to take on debt right now, but that's because of the form of that debt. That's traditionally hard debt, which means that it comes with mandatory payments. If you don't make those payments, the loan goes into default. Someone can foreclose on your business. Someone can take it over, sell the assets or something like that. That's extremely scary right now, just because of how uncertain these next few months, hopefully it's months and not years, are going to be. But in the cooperative conversion space, there are lenders that are willing to lend soft debt. This is non-extractive financing. It means that it's not going to use your business as a resource to be sold, to be exchanged. It's money that comes into your business, and you only pay those loans, for example, if your business makes profits. So there's not sort of a gun to the head of your business that's forcing it to do everything that's necessary to pay off that debt, even if you can't. It's less scary. The lenders, I have a link to lenders that you can find that do this type of financing right now. So you can click on that. I'll show the presentation afterwards. I think for the business owner to consider here too is, what's their role in the business after all this happens? You know, this is a big decision. It seems like a really big decision, because it seems like you're completely sacrificing control, where if you just pay your employees partially in equity, you probably aren't sacrificing complete control. But in a worker cooperative conversion specifically, oftentimes you don't lose control, and owners can stay on and continue working in the business. A basic overview of how this works, how management works in a cooperative, is on the left of this slide. You can see that the cooperative membership, which is the people that work in the business, they vote for the board of directors, or they are the board of directors in a different type of worker cooperative. And then they select the people that are going to manage this business. Not every co-op has managers, but this is a fairly common way of structuring a worker cooperative. And the relevance of this for a small business owner is that in a conversion, you often see that the owner stays on in as the general manager, or at least in a management or consulting capacity, to help the business transition, to help it figure out its business plan moving forward. Oftentimes, the owners only stay on for the duration of the financing that they provide themselves, which is called seller financing, to ensure that the business can continue to make profits that will pay off their loan. But right now, a lot of this is happening with business owners that are retiring. And so those business owners don't want to stay too long. It's possible for you to convert your business to a cooperative and then be a worker like any of the other workers. Your voice is going to continue to have more sway than most of the other workers, just in terms of your expertise, in terms of your intricate knowledge of your business. So you won't lose control, even if you just have the same amount of control as everybody else and you're not in a management position or something like that. And how can you finance this? Because as I mentioned, there's not a lot of financing going around at the moment, at least not from traditional lenders. But that's actually okay when it comes to a cooperative conversion, because many of these are financed in large part by seller financing, which is money that a small business owner loans to their small business to pay off their amount of equity in their business. And the business then repays you over time from profits that it makes, or there's mandatory payments. You can mix the hard debt and soft debt that you require and the financing that you provide. Right now, I would guess that because of how uncertain these coming months are going to be, that if you provided seller financing, assuming the workers had an attorney that helped them out, which is not that often the case, they would probably negotiate for a large percentage of that to be soft debt. And if you want to stay on with your business and you want your business to continue succeeding, it would probably also be in your best interest to negotiate a large amount of that as a soft debt, which basically, if the business makes money, your loan would be paid off from the earnings of the business over time. As I've already mentioned, you can get fines non-extractive debt financing too. And then this is where the partial equity piece comes in from the previous section. Often in a worker cooperative, everybody that works in the business has an equity stake that is required for them to buy into the business. This can be minimal. It can be like $100, but it can also be really large, like $5,000 or even more. So in a cooperative conversion, this equity is typically contributed through paycheck deductions, which is essentially reducing hours and wages and paying workers partly in equity. It's functionally equivalent to that. So that is something that you can do now. So everything that I talked about in the previous section could be done here. You can reduce hours and wages. You can pay partially in equity if you initiate a conversion right now. So this can not only be a strategy for helping your business find working capital if you can hook up with one of these non-extractive debt financiers, but it can also be a way to reduce your expenses and preserve any income if your workers are able to continue working at all. So it combines sort of the best of the previous approach. I'm assuming there's probably some people that do this work that are on this call with me, and they're probably laughing and scratching their heads and saying, how can this be done fast enough to be a solution to this crisis? And I guess one answer is that I don't know how long this crisis is going to last, but another is that using the traditional method, there's no way that this can be done quickly enough to be a solution to this crisis, because you can't do it quickly enough to actually reduce wages in order to have equity paying part of it. You can't do it fast enough to acquire the financing you need to get working capital into your business to help it survive. But I'm not one to let the common wisdom hold me down. I do think that there is a way to do this fast enough, and I'm going to walk you through the way that that can be done. So here's how, sort of a brainstorm on how you can do a cooperative conversion quickly enough to make it serve as a solution in this moment. First is making the price that you pay, or that the workers pay for the business, reasonable. Reasonability in terms of price is a combination of two things. One, it's a combination of getting your valuation in the ballpark. Frankly, no one really knows how much a business is worth. There's a ton of different methods, but it's like anything that you sell. You can attach any price to it that someone is willing to pay. So part of making a price reasonable is giving a valuation, showing your work, like when you did a math problem in high school, like showing people how you get to that valuation, fitting it into a typical methodology, and then using a type of debt that makes it feasible to buy at that price, that makes it not scary. It makes the number, no matter what number you throw out, if that number is in the ballpark, it makes the people that are buying believe that it's possible and that they're not going to have to, say, reduce their salaries, which can happen, to pay off the debt, to make the mandatory debt payments. Workers don't want to get in that scenario. That lengthens the negotiation and makes it hard to come to the table. So if you're able to provide seller financing, if you're able to obtain other financing that's soft debt, that really lessens the load and makes this process move more quickly. So in terms of the traditional timeline, we're talking about the feasibility study and the valuation. On this estimated timeline, we're talking about 8 weeks that you can reduce substantially depending on the way that you structure the transaction. If you come to the table, if you realize what the people on the other side of the table are needing, and that you can meet their needs in a way that still meets your needs. Another thing you can do to make the process quicker is stay with the business. This gives you security. It can ensure that if you're providing financing to the business, you're still going to be there. You're still going to be in management or something like that. And you can ensure that the business plan that you have continues to be the business plan, that everything for the time being is more or less the same. This also helps you obtain outside financing because outside debt lenders are more comfortable oftentimes when the owner remains in the business and they can trust that it's not all going to go up in smoke the minute that the transition happens. So if you stay with the business, you have deferred planning for a management succession. Yeah. So you've deferred that for a good long time. So you don't have to do that work on the front end. Another way you can do this quickly is using seller financing in a way as bridge financing. Bridge financing is typically financing that you take on with the intent to take out that financing, or at least find a way to take out a portion of it. So if you're a small business owner and you're thinking of doing this, you can immediately finance the whole thing. I recognize that sounds scary. That does happen in some deals where they're fully seller financed. But the only thing holding you back is you at that point in terms of timing. When you have a promissory note that guarantees that the business will pay you back, you can commit the business to doing a number of things. You can commit them to finding outside debt financing. You can specify that this is in a way, at least partially, a bridge loan. And you can specify maybe 6 months, something like that, where the business then goes out and looks to obtain outside debt financing. It might be easier once we're a few months into this crisis and we have a better idea of what's going to happen to get that outside debt financing in and take out a portion of your loan. At that point, you can convert a portion of yours to hard debt financing so that you have some mandatory payments or something like that. So in essence, what this gets you to, I'll show you on this as well. So then you're delaying this too down the road, your funding search. You're delaying a number of weeks down the road. All of this gets you a way to accomplish the transition while committing yourself to doing some of the work after the initial conversion. The final piece that allows you to do this quickly and in time to address this current crisis is, in a way, being willing to accept that you don't need to make something perfect. And in fact, there's a danger to coming up with the perfect cooperative structure right from the get-go. Rich Bartlett is one of my favorite people writing about organizational design and organizational change. And he has sort of this tongue-in-cheek tweet where he says the best organizational design that perfectly fits all the groups that we work with is the organizational design that you already have. So it doesn't really matter where you start. And I really truly do believe that. So you can start with the template cooperative bylaws that we have on the Sustainable Economies Law Center's website. There are a number of cooperative bylaws that you can find as templates. What you really need is a commitment, a courageous commitment to the vulnerable work of learning how to operate a cooperative once you get into it. If you know that you believe in the structure, if you know that this is a way that you can respond to this crisis, what you need is to believe and to work with your workers and to create spaces where you can learn about each other and you can learn how to trust each other to facilitate a culture of change that allows you to begin taking continual steps in the right direction. What this is pretty different, I will acknowledge, from the way that most cooperative conversions work. I think that there's a tendency to see the creation of a cooperative or the conversion of a business from a traditional form to a cooperative form as, in a way, equivalent to a revolution, like the founding of the United States, where our founding fathers took time and time and time, so much time, to create a constitution and to create a form of government, and really tried to make it perfect and tried to make it hard to change moving forward. And frankly, look where that's gotten us. It's really hard to change our system, and it's not agile enough, and it's not nimble enough to respond to the problems that it needs to respond to in real time and adapt. I think that in terms of creating a culture of change, it's detrimental to do all of the work up front and front load it and put so much stress and so much tension on making something perfect from the very beginning. It really can lock you into the structures that you've created and prevent you from creating sort of an agile and nimble cooperative moving forward. That's my 2 cents. I guess that's my soapbox. But what that gets you is a deferral of designing the new business structure as well. So in a way, the way to use cooperative conversion as a response to this current crisis is to defer a lot of the work to the end. That requires a lot of trust, but the terms that you put into the deal structure also help to create a lot of trust if you do it in the way that I've outlined here. It's a lot of information, so thank you for hanging in there with me. Lastly, I'm going to turn to sort of the downer solution to all of this, but not necessarily a bad solution. As I mentioned at the very beginning, a lot of businesses have not been able to access government loans. A lot of businesses are burning through or have already burned through their cash buffer and are likely going to have to shut themselves down, which means putting themselves into bankruptcy or other processes like assignment for the benefit of creditors, which is a California level sort of bankruptcy. I want to note briefly, look, I'm not an expert in bankruptcy, but I know enough to know that it is a possibility to create a cooperative conversion through the bankruptcy process. So there is a light at the end of the tunnel. You can send a business through bankruptcy, sort of clean it in the wash, and you can come out with a worker-owned business, and you can come out in some control of the business, whether that's as a manager, whether it's as a worker owner, something like that. So you can have an ownership interest in the thing that you put through bankruptcy, even though typically the business is sold to somebody else. And this happens more than you think. Yeah, it's normally with businesses that are doing pretty shady things, but there's nothing necessarily fraudulent about this. As long as you don't actually commit fraud, it happens quite a bit and it's fairly common. I'll go through some of just briefly, the 3 ways that this would work. First, there's a process called assignment for the benefit of creditors. In this process, your business is basically liquidated. All the assets of the businesses are sold, free of the unsecured debt that is attached to it, not of the secured debt that has to be paid off. And all of the assets of the business can be sold. Some of the assets of the business can be sold. As with all of these options, what is necessary in order to use these as a way to facilitate a cooperative conversion is advance notice to the workers. They need to know in advance. At least if you are going to continue as a small business owner being a part of the business after this transition, the workers need to know in advance. This process, assignment for the benefit of creditors, has been used for a worker co-op conversion with a company called Box Pack and Ship out of Los Angeles. The workers bought about 20% of the business and began to run it as a co-op. There's 2 types of bankruptcy that could also yield a worker co-op. One is Chapter 7, which is a liquidation process, which means all the assets are sold individually. Again, workers need advance notice. They need to have the financing lined up as soon as the assets start getting liquidated. So they need advance notice to figure out what a worker co-op is, what it would mean for them, and then to go out and find outside debt financing, probably, to buy the business. This is the least likely to actually yield a worker co-op just because the process takes a long time. Workers are often going to leave the business because it takes so long and it's just tedious. So the better bankruptcy process in terms of creating a worker co-op on the end of it is Chapter 11, which is a reorganization plan. That's where you as a small business owner stay in control of your business, but figure out a plan with the court to pay off the debts of your business in sort of an orderly way. You can sell your business when you're in the midst of this reorganization process. What the bankruptcy court needs to be convinced of is that doing so will help you pay off your creditors. So you'd want to say things like, this is going to help me access working capital. This is going to help me grow the business, have more people, have more minds at the table, making this business grow. And again, workers just need advance notice. Just don't commit fraud. That's the basic thing. Fraud, basically, in this kind of situation is colluding with whoever is going to be the person liquidating the assets of the business or selling it, to have them only offer it to the workers for sale or only offer it to you as sort of a sham sale for an artificially low value. That's sort of the range of fraud. I'm not going to go into that. Obviously, if you enter the process, an attorney would help you figure out what that looks like. I just want to lay it on the table as an option in case you're interested in that. So that's all that I have. Thank you so much for putting up with me chatting your ear off for this whole time. I will stop sharing my screen so you can see me and we can move into questions.
Excellent. I got a question sent on the chat privately. One was, what's been the interest level from business owners that you've observed so far, and has the interest in co-op conversions specifically as a solution to COVID-19 increased?
That's a great question. I haven't been contacted by a lot of businesses that are interested in conversion right now, so I can't speak specifically to it. I know that I can speak to past crises that have happened, and you can look not necessarily in the United States. Well, you can look in the Great Recession. Sorry, this is me being historical and not responding to this immediate moment, but you can look in the Great Depression in California, and there's sort of a flowering of co-ops in the Bay Area because people don't have work and they're unemployed and they want to buy these businesses. They want some way to contribute and get money. And in the financial crisis, the highest profile one in sort of world history right now that a lot of people know about is from Argentina when they had a financial crisis. And banks, contrary to what happens in the United States, the banks did not get bailed out. The banks bailed themselves in, which means the banks kept your money and prevented you from getting it. And the funders that I mentioned in this presentation, the Working World and the Seed Commons, that's where they started, was financing acquisitions of businesses by the workers in that kind of a crisis. So while I haven't seen it yet, I think it's too early, and I think that it's a ripe time for this to happen.
Excellent. Another question is, if we want workers to be in control of the business after buying it, why is there still a board of directors?
That's a great question. So there's two typical options in a worker co-op in terms of how you would structure your board of directors. One is called a collective board of directors, where the workers are the board of directors. So there's no separation between the workers and the board of directors. So that means that the workers are making the big picture policy decisions about the organization. This can happen even in fairly large co-ops. You have Rainbow Grocery, which is about 200 workers, and Cheese Board Collective in Berkeley that are about 60 workers, and that's their kind of structure. And the flip side is having a representative board of directors. The board of directors in that case can consist solely of workers, but just sort of a segment of workers that have been elected by their fellow workers to represent their interest. So in that way, the workers are still in control of the business, but it's just not all of the workers. It creates sort of a potentially more nimble structure. So they're still in control. They're just not all doing it all together.
Another question is there a legal structure that is the most flexible if you are looking to convert to a co-op, LLC, sole proprietor, or ...
It's a good question. I take it to mean what is the most flexible structure to convert into. It might also be what is the most flexible structure to convert out of. I'll speak to into first. Into, it depends. It depends on it. Well, that's the most lawyerly thing of me to say is that it depends, but it really does depend. Generally, people would say that a LLC is the most flexible structure that allows you to structure your cooperative in any way that not any way that you want. You're bound by federal tax law, essentially, but you can structure it differently. And yeah, it's more flexible than a cooperative corporation. Although California's cooperative corporation statute allows you a substantial amount of flexibility, but is definitely not the most flexible structure in terms of cooperative statutes across the country. So there's a good amount of flexibility there, but there's more flexibility in the LLC structure.
Awesome. Those are the only questions we have so far. I think we have time for another one.
Yeah, about one more.
And feel free to unmute yourselves if you'd rather just ask the question out loud.
Are you seeing any businesses that are in this transition right now? Have you heard of any?
I know that there are businesses that are in the process right now. I don't know of any that have started just during this crisis, but I know that there are some around that are happening, and then having to enter into this crisis while it's happening. I can't name names, but I can say that a few of them have definitely paused just because it's a moment, it's been a month, and it might be more of crisis management in a way. So just the attention needed to focus on this type of thing at the moment isn't there for some people. And I think that that will be a struggle of trying to do this right now. For others that are, I think the others that I know of are not in as precarious of a situation, and they've been able to continue just sort of doing the mental work. They're front loading all of the conversion elements, and so they're just continuing to do sort of the work online that they can do to work on those elements right now.
Quick question on non-extractive loan funds. Can you just direct me to a good source for looking into entities that do that?
The ones that I know right now, the Working World is the primary one that I know. There are other loan funds set up for cooperative conversion, but I don't know. I should know, but I don't know what kind of financing they offer. So there's a link in this presentation that I'll send out afterwards. Tia, I have everyone's email so I can send information. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And Ian just linked it in the chat box to what the link is in the presentation.
Perfect.
Okay, well, I think we're at time. Thank you all for joining us for this presentation. I hope it was helpful. I'll follow up and share a recording of this once I get that done, and so a link to some resources that I'll attach for you as well.
Yay, thank you so much, Jay.
Thanks, everyone.
If you just